Greetings, thrashers, headbangers, and rebel-rousers! It's your local trash panda Slayer here. 2 episodes into my metal retrospective series, and I can safely say that a lot of bands' discographies can be a mixed bag to say the least. In fact, most bands have at least one dud in their catalog, and many more will completely shit the bed during a midlife crisis and never fully recover from it. But then you've got the rare case of an all-killer, no-filler act, in which their worst album is still a bona fide masterpiece. And I think I found a great example of that. The OG Kings of Death Metal, Death. Now I just want to preface this retrospective by saying this. Death metal is not a genre for everyone, even for some metalheads. Those blaring, crunchy riffs and Cookie Monster vocals can be a turn-off for some. But if you do want to gradually get into death metal, I'd start off by listening to Iron Maiden and Judas Priest, then moving on to Metallica, then Slayer, and finally on to Death. This band is honestly the best way of getting into screaming music, as the uninitiated call it. But behind those screams lie pure poetry, thoughtful, well-crafted lyrics that tell a story. Contrary to popular belief, not all death metal lyrics merely play Mad Libs with bodily fluids and medical terminology. So if you got a broad vocabulary and passion for philosophy like me, Death are right up your alley. So let's not waste any more time and get into the history of Death. Death was originally formed as Mantis back in 1983 by the one, the only, Chuck Schuldiner, before changing their name to Death soon afterwards. Many music aficionados such as me have to mention this to avoid confusion, but there was also an all-black punk band in the mid-70s called Death, who remained unknown until their unreleased discography was released in the late 2000s. But I'm not here to talk about punk, yet. Death along with Possessed are commonly cited as the first death metal bands in history. Now Possessed released their debut 2 years before Death, so I'd say they beat Death to the finish line in terms of the first death metal album, but Death more than made up for that with their perfect discography, and it all starts with Scream Bloody Gore. Thrash metal was the king of metal genres during the mid-80s. Okay, actually it was far usurped in terms of popularity by wimpy poser fluff such as Poison, but still, thrash was the meanest, baddest son of a bitch out there. But in the underground lurked a new king of heaviness known as death metal, and Death's Scream Bloody Gore was a real turning point that would inspire many imitators to come. This early in the genre's lifespan though, parts of it still kinda sound a bit like a heavier and, let's be real, better version of Slayer, as exemplified by the opener, Infernal Death. Nonetheless, Death scored a home run right out of the gate, and Scream Bloody Gore is still a must-listen death metal album even now. As for my favorite track, all of them are great, but for me, Evil Dead just takes the cake. I could listen to that opening guitar melody all fucking day. Scream Bloody Gore kicked off the death metal scene that's still going strong 35 years later. But Death were always about one-upping themselves, and in 1988, they do that with Leprosy. Within the first seconds of listening to this album, you can feel the refinement. For one, the production is way better, especially the thicker, more rich guitar tone. Death finally abandoned any and all Slayer worship that was to be found on the previous album, and it's the first real step into what we now know as the distinctive Death sound. Now might as well be a better time than any to discuss Chuck Schuldiner's talent on the fretboard. Whether it be those sick riffs or those searing solos, Chuck is one of the best guitarists in extreme metal. The drum work on Leprosy is also top-notch, with an intense snare sound reminiscent of cannon fire combined with those galloping double bass drums. Leprosy is the first truly perfect Death album. Obviously, that is not a knock against Scream Bloody Gore. After all, this is Death, a band that has never even come close to releasing an album that's below A tier. But Leprosy is a fucking god tier album. 40 minutes of pounding metallic might with nary a second of filler. A must-own for fans of extreme metal. But the decade of decadence was coming to an end, and whereas other metal genres were soon to be left up shit's creek without a paddle, extreme metal would enter its golden period in the 90s. And Death without question would strike gold here, kicking off the 90s with some spiritual healing. I think most of us metalheads can agree that 1990 was an amazing year for metal. Painkiller, Rust in Peace, Cowboys from Hell, and in Death's case, spiritual healing. This would mark the last of the pure death metal albums before Death went into a more technical and progressive direction. And once again, the guitar work, the lyrics, it's all top-notch.
Always locking the doors to your mind, escaping reality that surrounds you. Using fame an excuse to kill. A sick way of life is now.
I've heard some say that this is Death's worst, or shall I say, weakest album. After all Death albums are masterpieces. I really don't agree with that. If I did have to pick a weakest Death album, I would say their debut, but only because they hadn't truly found their identity yet. Spiritual Healing overall is the perfect bridge between the pure 80s death metal albums and what's to come. You can hear some early hints of the technical and melodic death metal they'd be known for in the rest of the 90s. The next year, Death would kickstart their technical era with something a little more human, so to speak. I guess you could call Human Death's growing up album. A lot of bands go through a maturing phase to mixed results. In many cases, it involves a band throwing away all of their rock and roll rebellion in favor of boring, safe, pretentious wankfests. But not Death. Along with the new sound came a new drummer, Sean Reinhardt, who was only 19 as of this album's recording, and sadly passed away a couple years ago. And boy, Sean is such a great drummer who really makes this album what it is. We also have some brief experiments with keyboards and ambience on the instrumental track, Cosmic Sea. And it just works. By extension, we have a closer in the form of a Kiss cover, which I find to be a bit odd for a death metal band. Personally, I'm not big into Kiss, but this cover is great. This album would lay the groundwork for dozens of technical and progressive death metal acts to come. Y'all kids like Gojira, huh? Well, they probably wouldn't exist had it not been for albums such as Human, a progressive masterpiece that holds up amazingly even 30 years later. 1993 would see a continuation of this sound, with individual thought patterns. Progressive rock and metal definitely has a mixed reputation in the rock sphere. Some people see prog as protracted, meandering pretentiousness, but I think Death does prog very well. It's more about the technicality of it, not overly long 6-part epics. If pure death metal Death is music to listen to when you're pissed off and having a really shitty day, Then prog death is the music you listen to whenever you want something that's heavy and aggressive, but also expansive, complex, and enlightening. Individual Thought Patterns does this perfectly without a single track that surpasses the 5-minute mark, and the entire album only being 10 minutes longer than the Ramones' debut effort, if you could believe that. Overall, it's great prog metal done right. Superb technical death metal, but it would only get better with 1995's Symbolic. 1995 was not a good year for metal music, at least for the more mainstream acts, but this unbelievably banal year did give us Symbolic, a further evolution of their 90s tech death sound, and at this point I've realized something absolutely astonishing. Not only does Death not have a single bad album, they don't even have one bad song in their repertoire. I'm really impressed by that. Symbolic is heavier on the uncommon beats and time signatures than the previous outing, with only marginally longer song length. Overall, this might be my favorite Death album of their 90s period, and it is without question one of the best albums of 1995. But Death was reaching the end of the road, with one more album to cap off the 90s. I'm talking about The Sound of Perseverance. All good things must come to an end. You can't make an endless procession of greatness, as eventually the creativity well dries up and mediocrity ensues, if not outright garbage. Chuck Schuldiner around this time was reportedly growing disillusioned with death metal, as the following year would see him release a debut album with his second band, Controlled Denied. This album features clean vocals as opposed to those infamous harsh vocals we all know and love. Not only that, but Chuck was diagnosed with brain cancer around this time, so he was on borrowed time. But in spite of the omnipresent turmoil, Death ended their discography with a bang. The Sound of Perseverance is many a metalhead's favorite Death album, and with good reason. 7 albums in, and Death was still an all-killer, no-filler act. Every song on this album is a masterpiece, including the Painkiller cover. Personally, I think it pales in comparison to the original, but it's a fantastic way to cap off a career, and a glorious love letter to the original 1990 metal masterpiece. In December 2001, Chuck would sadly succumb to cancer at the age of 34, a tragic loss that absolutely shook the metal world. Chuck was a sheer musical genius whose life was taken too soon, and I'm very certain his future efforts with Control Denied would have been bona fide gold as well. But Chuck Schuldiner's sheer brilliance and skill will always live on as an inspiration to future metalheads for years to come. I'm way too young to have experienced death back when Chuck was still alive. I was still a toddler when he passed away, for crying out loud. And I wouldn't discover the death metal subgenre until I was around 9 years old, somewhere around that. Death themselves I wouldn't get into until I turned 18, but they've quickly gone on to become one of my top 5 favorite bands of any genre period. I cannot name a single bad song or album from them. They are that fucking good. Even if you aren't big into extreme metal, I highly encourage you to give their discography a listen. And you don't have to choose any particular album to start off with. They are all S-tier albums worthy of any metalhead's collection.